Given that we've got one branch of government that makes the laws, one branch that enforces them, or is supposed to, and another branch that interprets them, we're bound to a certain degree by the separation of powers themselves. But when the separation of powers is abused and it's neglected chronically, it's time for the lawmaking branch, the branch where I work that makes the laws, and the branch where Carolyn would like to serve with me, which would be kind of fun, because I know Carolyn well and really like her. She, as a lawmaker, could still change the laws. Change the laws, giving less unbridled discretion to the President of the United States to do a lot of things. Now, I don't think he's within his authority in the way he's handling a lot of things with regard to asylum and a lot of things with regard to what's called immigration parole. I think he's stepping far outside the bounds of what the law even allows. But even still, there's some wiggle room in the laws that could be closed. I've introduced legislation called the Stopping Border Surges Act. That's been incorporated into a bill called H.R. 2, passed by the House of Representatives. We could have, and I believe we should have, demanded that H.R. 2, either in its entirety or at least in substantial part, be incorporated as part and parcel of one of the spending bills we just passed. Had Congress been willing to stand its ground on that and say that this needs to happen, we might have had that opportunity. But we do need Congress to be able to push back, and where necessary, to flex its muscle and to change the law where the president's abusing them. Where the president doesn't want to cooperate in the change of the law, then you look at the areas of interest. What is he interested in doing? He can't fund his own government. Congress does, and there are ways of bringing that into law, even when the president doesn't wholeheartedly support it.
Yes, so what I have been consistently saying is essentially what Mike just said so much better. But really, it does just come down to, right, I was curious if you were going to add anything, because I'd love for them to be some other lever that Congress could pull aside from basically the funding, right? We know, and in fact, I've had conversations with some Republicans, even one last night, who at all cost does not want members of Congress to hold up spending on anything in order to make the changes that are so clearly necessary to be made with regard to the executive branch complete abuse.
Yeah, that's an indefensible position. And I don't know who the person was you were talking about, but he or she should reconsider that. I mean, there's a reason why the Founding Fathers put the power to make law and the power to fund the government in the hands of the legislative branch, the branch most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. And this is a good example of why. When you've got a president who's not enforcing the law, then Congress needs to reevaluate what the law says.
And you have been in the Senate long enough. You were part of that first shutdown, and you know the blowback that occurred as a result of that. I think the people are over what was kind of, I think, manipulation of the public, right? The fear of a shutdown. You remember Obama took steps, and he explicitly said that it was to cause pain to the American people when he shut down things that didn't need to be shut down, right? Like the national parks. I think Utah still has over $1 million, correct? Are we still trying to pursue that over $1 million that the feds owe us? Because we kept our national parks open with the promise that the feds would pay. There were efforts to make people feel pain when it wasn't. That wasn't occurring to the average American as a result of that.
Right, and the narrative, because a number of Republicans, unfortunately, joined forces with President Obama in blaming other Republicans, people like me, saying, look, we're willing to fund everything else in government separately. We'll do that. In fact, I proposed all kinds of legislation to keep the rest of government funded. I just wanted Obamacare's funding to be debated on its own merits, rather than riding on the coattails of funding for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and everything else. We offered 1,000 different paths by which we could have and should have avoided a shutdown. President Obama chose to shut it down. And because, regrettably, a number of Republicans chose to take his side rather than the side of what a lot of people in our state and in a lot of other states were calling for, which is let's have a separate debate on funding Obamacare. That became the narrative.
And I'm just going to say one thing. I've actually never said this to you, and you do not have to comment if you don't want to. But what I've noticed when we have Republicans who talk all the time about working across the aisle, every single one of them who uses that phrase that I've seen in my work in politics is one who is consistently unwilling to work on their own side of the aisle. Just something I've noticed.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about that for just a second, and I promise to be brief here. But working across the aisle isn't novel. It's not new. It's not an end in and of itself. It is actually an inevitability on most legislation in the Senate, because of the way the Senate rules work. Most legislation, with relatively few exceptions, will have to go through a process called cloture, where you bring debate to a close. That takes 60 votes, even though the ultimate passage is by 51 votes. So in order to get to cloture, which you need on almost all legislation, unless you're operating the very narrow, rare field of budget reconciliation, you're going to have bipartisanship. So to say, oh, work across the aisle doesn't make that novel. That's just what happens in a legislative process. It matters. So there's nothing remarkable about saying, I'll reach across the aisle. It's where and how and under what circumstances. You don't want somebody who's going to view it as an end unto itself. It's not an end. It's just the path that you take to get there. It doesn't make you unique as a politician to say that. What matters is where. I do stuff across the aisle all the time. I've got a bill that I'm pushing right now in the Senate that's going to become very relevant in the next couple of weeks with Dick Durbin, who's a liberal Democrat from Illinois. It's a bill that's designed to keep the federal government from spying on you without a warrant under FISA 702. He and I agree on that. We disagree on a ton of stuff, but we're friends because we sometimes agree on things. There are some areas, lots of interstitial spaces where there's not a diametric opposition between the two political parties, and you have to look for those. But to identify that as an end unto itself usually misses the point.
Yeah, good point.